So I'd like to introduce to you Crystal Clancy. Crystal is committed to raising the profile of and contributing to the expansion of the AOD lived experience workforce. She's spent her career embedded in the journey of AOD peer support and lived experience and living experience workforce development in Victoria and nationally. At SHARC, she was the coordinator of peer projects. At the time, it was established to drive lived experience workforce development and advocacy. And she's currently on secondment at the Department of Health, supporting the AOD strategy team and the mental health and wellbeing divisions that are committed to embedding AOD lived and living experience in their way of working. And I should note that Crystal is the first AOD lived experience person to go into that program. So it's a great honour to have her there and doing great work. She's a strong lived experience advocate who seeks to build the capability of workforces, organisations, sectors, government and the community to understand and truly experience the unparalleled value inherent in lived experience. So with the topic of the journey of AOD lived experience workforce, who are we, where we've been and where we're moving towards, please welcome Crystal Clancy.
Thank you, Matt. It's just been such an honour to be here today and to see, I suppose, the growth in the workforce, but to see the workforces coming together to celebrate and co-learn. And I really appreciate all the work that's gone into today. I'm going to attempt to, I've made slides, so I'm going to attempt to share those on my screen now. I'm talking today about the journey of the AOD lived experience workforce. And more specifically, sorry, my computer's just catching up. I want to talk about the journey that I've been honoured of being part of. So the journey I'll speak of today is that of the AOD peer worker. And I think that's because I've had the honour of being part of that journey from the beginning. So firstly, I'll show you, I'll acknowledge that the AOD lived experience workforce, and this is one of the learnings that we've had on the journey of developing the peer workforce, is that it's much larger than the peer workforce. So there's, those that are doing the direct service delivery, but it's also the advocates and consultants that operate a systemic and strategic level, and the leaders, the CEOs, the champions, those that are working in government. There's a lived experience workforce in alcohol and other drugs that is far more broad than the direct service delivery. And so I wanted to acknowledge that. What we have here is the definition of a peer worker. So this definition was developed by the AOD Peer Workforce Community of Practice. And one of the things that makes this workforce a little bit different from the living experience workforce is that for many organisations, the qualification includes peer workers with a lived experience of not only substance use and or addiction, but also recovery. It's important to note that this is a tricky criteria because there's no precise definition of recovery. It's personally defined and it's unique. So where we've been, there's very little written history that I can find around AOD lived experience work. What I have found, though, is that I found this historical perspective from the United States, and it kind of reflects some of the anecdotal evidence that I've been provided by people in the movement over the years. It's important to note that people with lived experience and living experience have been pivotal in early recovery-focused initiatives, but also in harm reduction initiatives, support groups, and they're very well recognised for the contribution to what the AOD workforce in Australia is today. The other thing I wanted to note is that the harm reduction and living experience workforce have travelled over the last 35 years from HIV prevention through to incorporated into the lived and living experience workforce structure that we have today, and are very much part of the roots of the lived experience workforce. So the journey I speak about starts in 2014, and the reason is that this is when there was some reforms in the sector and all peer support activity was decommissioned. So what we had is no activity for peer support across the sector. There was lobbying from champions in the sector, and the department supported the first formal peer support capacity building project because they saw that there was a need to re-establish the peer movement. That's a little brochure from one of the peer support groups that were established under that project. There are 15 groups established, and that was the first of the activity that started. And what happened from this work was there was an understanding that peer work was not a free and unsupported activity. Agencies began to see the value in the work that was happening from these peer volunteers and began finding ways to fund and resource the activity that was happening. This is when we had the beginnings of a formalised, recognised and remunerated AOD peer workforce in Victoria. The department also understood this evolution and started to support SHARC to undertake work ensuring sector readiness, because what we started to see was peer workers evolving and emerging into the space, and we needed to get ready for that. In 2017, Peer Projects was established as a program of SHARC, and this was established to provide a dedicated effort into workforce development. A framework for peer workforce development was established. That included peer worker trainings and organisational readiness trainings. We also looked internationally and started to have relationships with organisations such as Intentional Peer Support, and started to leverage off some of the learnings from them to create the space that we have today, and I suppose create the perspective that we work from today. We also developed Victoria's Alcohol and Other Drug Peer Workforce Community of Practice and held our first AOD Peer Workforce Forum. In 2018, better practice guidelines for organisations employing peer workers were published in Victoria's Alcohol and Other Drug Program Guidelines. There was also the development and the launch of the strategy for the AOD peer workforce in Victoria. This was launched alongside the mental health care and consumer workforce strategies. What's important about these strategies is these were a formal acknowledgement by the department that there was a strategic direction for lived experience to grow. So we've gone from having zero peer and lived experience activity in the sector to having strategic direction. Victoria's peer workforce development was also recognised in a national award. There was a growing national recognition regarding the value of lived experience in alcohol and other drugs. The peer workforce core competencies were developed and co-designed by the community of practice. And SHARC continues to act as a central resource for peer workforce development. This is to ensure meaningful, established and supported workforce and agencies that have the capacity to integrate this workforce successfully. There's a little bit here on the strategy, and I won't go too deep into it because I think that those that are here today really have probably had a look at it. But I suppose what I wanted to point out was that what we have here is a vision for the peer workforce, and I feel really pleased to kind of sit back and reflect on that today and see that we've kind of exceeded this vision already in such a short time. So a lot happened on the way. On the way in this journey that I've discussed, there were so many champions for AOD peer work that advocated for the discipline, presented at forums locally and interstate. There were leads in peer workforce development who were supported and partnered with allies in mental health. We are here and where we are now because of this relationship and the shared learnings. We've been inspired and supported by our champions in harm reduction, who have been activists for the voice of lived experience since the early 80s. We've united with harm reduction and the living experience peer workforce to work on a shared vision of being understood, valued and recognised. Many of the peer support groups that we established early in 2014 are still flourishing, and many more have been established. We've grown alongside consumer participation movement, which began to appear in policy in the early 90s, and with the establishment of the Association of Participating Service Users in 2000. AOD peer workers are now embedded in the justice system through the drug courts and the Family Drug Treatment Court. We've gone interstate to share our learnings and help evolve the lived experience initiatives that are happening in Queensland, Tasmania. We've shared our journey with other sectors such as homelessness to assist them embarking on the journey of introducing and formalising a lived experience workforce. And it's important to note that not only have there been a lot of champions and support from government, but there's been a lot of agencies really eager and proactive in building their workforces and seeking opportunities to learn and grow. So where are we now? I think we've landed. I think we're here to stay. The current state is around 50 identified AOD peer workers across the state. So that's over 92 lived and living experience. We have our first lived experience research position, academic position being advertised currently. There's so many opportunities that we've leveraged off from the Royal Commission and the report. And this has given fresh attention to the need to and the ways in which we can be more informed by lived and living experience more broadly. The Department of Health has really, on the Royal Commission report and also their learnings from having embedded lived experience in mental health for a number of years, is really committed to building the AOD lived and living experience capacity at a departmental level. So there's been establishment of formalised advisory positions, the establishment of a lived and living experience advisory group at a government level, and, of course, a sector secondee, which they see expanding in the future. Lived experience as well at the moment is best practice. It's a key part of service planning and delivery. No more is it this idea that we're knocking on a door saying, why aren't we here? Where are we moving toward? More identified positions as part of multidisciplinary teams, in policy development, in leadership functions, real ways to have voices in committees and across governments as standard practice. Representation, like I said before, as a norm rather than an add-on. Lived experience as an equal player at the decision-making table. Opportunities being built for leadership. Creative use of funding to enable growth of lived experience workforces within organisations. Enriching the foundations for the workforce to thrive through ongoing training opportunities, sector capability building and establishing career pathways for the discipline. Where I think we're moving toward at a higher level is consumer participation and co-design as standard practice, which will be led by organisational capability across the sector, continued advocacy for all lived experience perspectives, sitting back and saying whose voice isn't in the room today. More voices, louder voices for leadership as lived experience imperative, that there is in fact nothing about us without us. Understanding and elevating the intersectionality of lived and living experience, that there isn't a box that we all fit in, that we have shared experiences yet personally defined journeys and perspectives. And coming together for a shared vision, partnerships and co-learnings across sectors, joining our voices for a movement that goes beyond all of us here today and all that have gone before and all that are yet to come. So I'm really interested to talk to more of you after this presentation and in the future about where you think we're moving toward and how we can work together to find our shared vision and co-learn in this experience. Thank you.
It's great to see the history laid out in front of you like that. We kind of take, I guess, for granted how far it's come in the lived and living experience space in AOD, but I think there's a lot of relative parallels in the mental health space as well. So thank you. That was really...
No worries.
One person's asked, why does the peer experience workforce have to have an experience of recovery, and how we can acknowledge or better acknowledge the harm reduction sector?
Yeah, really good question. I think the recovery or stability is part of the remit for treatment organisations. So even though AOD, lived and living experience workers work across the sector and community and in hospitals and in outreach, some organisations will ask that those individuals are in recovery And I think it is important that as a lived experience workforce that we recognise that the living experience workforce experiences a lot more stigma due to the criminalisation of their behaviour. And I think it's also another perspective as well that's really, really important to have for people in order to meet people where they're at. And I think that if we're working somewhere as a lived experience worker, we should be asking, why isn't there a living experience worker here as well?
That is a great point. And I think that's definitely where we need to get to. It's been interesting, I've been having some conversations with Nadia and Amelia and Sione about this, and how really we need to better understand that this is a continuum across a spectrum from, abstinence-based approach through to harm reduction and everything in between that. And the better we can get at seeing it as that spectrum and that continuum, the better we'll be able to build the workforce that can provide that level of service.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to note too, Matt, that the way that we define ourselves today is really about funding. It's really about the needs of organisations and services. But we can't lose the fact that we all exist on a continuum and that we don't always fit in a box. And we also need to be advocating for the others that aren't in the room, whether that's mental health, living experience, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. We need to kind of be considering what voice is missing.
Nadia, did you have a question you wanted to?
And I totally agree with, it's not really a question, I totally agree with what you're saying, that, lived experience peers asking why there's not living experience peers at a workplace. But I think we also have to face the facts that some places it's really dangerous for us to work, and there's not those safe places. And I think that's why it is important that the living and lived experience workforces work together alongside each other so we can push each other's, work with each other to push for changes. But I think, we sometimes need to identify that it isn't a safe space at some places for there to be living experience workers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nadia.
As a workforce or as workforces, we may not get to work beside each other, but we should still continue to work together. And that's the key point.